Putin sent 110,000 soldiers to capture a single city and lost almost all of them trying. Pokrovsk, the so-called easy target of the summer offensive, turned into Russia's worst nightmare. During June 2025, Ukrainian defenses turned every street into a trap and every field into an ambush point. Tanks burned, communications failed, and the Russian line collapsed. How did a besieged city withstand the largest concentration of Russian troops since Bakhmut and become the greatest symbol of Putin's failure? Pokrovsk is the axis that sustains all logistics across western Donetsk. Before the war, the city operated as one of the region's largest railway hubs. Its lines connect directly to Dnipro, Kramatorsk and Pavlohrad, vital arteries through which fuel, ammunition and supplies flow to Ukrainian brigades in the east. Losing Pokrovsk would mean breaking that chain. That's why military analysts call it the heart of Ukraine's logistical front. But its importance goes beyond infrastructure. Pokrovsk is what soldiers call the gateway to Donetsk. Whoever controls the city controls the routes leading to the regional capital and, more importantly, decides who keeps the front line supplied. From there, Russia could push the front in three critical directions: south toward Kurakhove, east to cut off Avdiivka, and north, opening the way to Kostiantynivka, the last stronghold before the industrial heart of the Donbass. Pokrovsk is the link that keeps all these fronts connected. For Moscow, capturing it would be more than a tactical win. It would be a political one. Taking Pokrovsk would mean reversing months of defeats and opening a new route to threaten Dnipro and, in theory, restart the advance toward Kiev. June 2025 marked the beginning of the largest concentration of Russian forces since the start of the war. More than 110,000 soldiers, spread across at least 14 mechanized and motorized brigades, converged into an arc stretching from Avdiivka to the Pokrovsk sector. Satellites showed entire columns of armored vehicles moving at dawn, brand new T-90Ms straight from the factories, upgraded T-72B3 tanks, and hundreds of BTR-82 transport vehicles. It was the kind of build-up that, on paper, should have crushed any defensive line. The Kremlin called the operation Summer Hammer. The plan was to use brute force to break the western axis of the Donbass and capture Pokrovsk in less than 2 weeks. With the city in Russian hands, the next step was a pincer maneuver, a double offensive towards Sloviansk and Kostiantynivka, two Ukrainian strongholds sustaining the entire northern flank. The Russian command believed that by breaking this line, Ukraine would be forced to retreat toward Dnipro, opening the way for a new phase of the war. In the Russian General Staff briefings, Pokrovsk was described as the knot that, once cut, would unravel the entire front. In the first days, it seemed Moscow had every advantage: 200 tanks advancing along 3 simultaneous axes, air cover from Su-34 fighters and K-52 helicopters, and heavy artillery firing more than 2,000 shells per day. It was a show of power, but also a repeat of the same mistakes that had already cost dearly in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Supply lines were too long, communication channels overloaded, and Ukrainian drone strikes began to disrupt the pace of the offensive. What was supposed to be a coordinated advance turned into logistical chaos. Russian armored vehicles bogged down in minefields, columns got lost without reliable GPS, and the Air Force failed to suppress Ukrainian air defenses that appeared like ghosts along the flanks. Pokrovsk, which Moscow believed to be the weakest point in Ukraine's defense, turned out to be the most fortified. In less than a week, the offensive that was meant to change the course of the war became a string of retreats, losses, and disarray. The generals in Donetsk began to realize the unthinkable. The largest Russian operation of the year was being defeated before it even reached the main battlefield. The collapse of the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk was the direct result of a military machine that entered 2025 exhausted, poorly equipped, and trapped in its own repeated mistakes. The first and most visible failure was in the armor. Since the beginning of the war, Russia had already lost more than 4,100 tanks, confirmed by independent analyses such as Oryx. Lacking the industrial capacity to replace those losses, Moscow began reactivating old models, T-62s and even T-55s, vehicles built more than 60 years ago. Many arrived at the front with steel plates welded by hand, a desperate attempt to make up for the lack of modern armor. Images coming out of Pokrovsk showed tanks with improvised iron cages welded over their turrets, nicknamed chicken coops by the soldiers. a crude defense against FPV drones that rarely worked. The result was predictable. Every precision artillery strike turned entire columns into metallic graveyards. But the problem went far beyond the machines. The composition of the troops itself exposed Russia's desperation. Field reports indicated that units from the 90th Armored Division and the 11th Army Corps were reinforced with freshly mobilized soldiers, many untrained and some literally sick. Military hospitals in Rostov reported medical casualties reclassified as fit for combat. Men with fevers, minor wounds, and even symptoms of exhaustion were being sent back to the trenches in Pokrovsk. It was the practical application of what British analyst Hamish de Bretton-Gordon called the meat grinder doctrine. The idea that Moscow tries to win by the number of bodies, not by the quality of combat. Pokrovsk became the most brutal example of that logic, where every meter gained cost dozens of lives. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strategy operated with surgical precision. Kiev's intelligence knew the Russian assault would depend on vulnerable logistics, so even before the offensive began, long-range artillery and drones started striking the rear. Fuel depots in Horlivka, ammunition convoys in Yasinuvata, and command centers near Makivka. Those attacks were designed to break the tempo of the Russian advance. With scarce fuel and compromised communications, Russian columns became trapped between destroyed supply lines and minefields ahead. Commercial satellites captured the result. Rows of immobilized tanks, burned-out trucks, and kilometers of roads blocked by wreckage. Ukrainian systems like the Bukovel AD and the Nota EW saturated Russian frequencies, cutting off signals from Orlan 10 reconnaissance drones and scrambling GPS coordinates. Without eyes on the battlefield, Russian strikes went blind. Artillery fire based on estimates rather than real targets. And with every attempt to reorganize, another barrage of HIMARS rained down on command posts detected by counter-battery radar. By the end of July, Pokrovsk had become a logistical hell for Moscow. Russian columns were trapped in corridors of destruction, hit from above by FPV drones and flanked by precision artillery. Numerical superiority had vanished. The summer hammer turned into a metallic meat grinder, where tanks, men, and plans were shredded with equal ruthlessness. The offensive that was supposed to mark the rebirth of Russian strength ended up revealing exactly the opposite: an army in collapse, without armor, without command, and without direction. The battle for Pokrovsk left a clear lesson. The difference between brute force and tactical intelligence can decide the outcome of an entire war. Russia bet on quantity, endless columns, frontal assaults, massive bombardments, as if sheer numbers could make up for the lack of precision. It was the old Soviet doctrine recycled: saturate, advance, and accept losses as a natural part of the process. But the modern battlefield doesn't forgive that kind of thinking. Every tank lost, every convoy destroyed, every isolated unit in Pokrovsk represented not just a tactical failure, but a slow erosion of Moscow's strategic capability. Ukraine, on the other hand, operated with time and terrain on its side. Aware of its limitations in manpower and firepower, it chose where and when to fight. Pokrovsk wasn't defended out of blind heroism, it was defended by calculation. Ukrainian forces knew the city was vital and turned it into a stronghold where every street, every intersection, every building had a military purpose. Retreat routes were pre-planned, artillery positions were mobile, and drones maintained constant surveillance over every Russian sector. Instead of wasting troops on pointless counterattacks, Ukraine focused on preserving strength and multiplying impact, a precision-based approach that traded how many for how. That contrast became even clearer in the casualty statistics. According to a recent analysis by The Economist, Russia suffers 4 to 5 times higher losses than Ukraine in direct combat. In the Pokrovsk offensive alone, estimates point to more than 28,000 Russian soldiers killed or incapacitated, roughly a quarter of the entire deployed force. Intelligence reports indicate the destruction of around 370 armored vehicles, 90 tanks, and dozens of artillery systems, a material the Russian military-industrial complex cannot replace fast enough. While Russia drains its resources trying to repeat the same failed model, Ukraine is perfecting a new one, combining battlefield intelligence with satellite data, coordinating FPV drones with artillery, and turning information into a weapon. This integration is what enables asymmetric victories, when a smaller army defeats a larger one not by matching its size, but by surpassing its precision. Pokrovsk proved that war no longer belongs to those who shout the loudest, but to those who think the fastest. And if Russia still insists on measuring power by the number of bodies and tanks, Kiev has already understood that in the 21st century, true power lies in coordination. What began as just another Russian offensive ended as a historic turning point, the moment when intelligence triumphed over force. The Pokrovsk offensive will be remembered as one of Russia's greatest military failures since the start of the war. The Kremlin gathered 110,000 soldiers, dozens of brigades, and hundreds of armored vehicles, only to watch everything collapse before a meticulously planned defense. The lack of modern tanks, tactical improvisation, and the desperate use of poorly trained troops turned the so-called summer hammer into a disaster waiting to happen. Meanwhile, Ukraine combined intelligence, drones, and precision artillery to dismantle every link in Russia's chain, from fuel depots to command posts. Today, Ukrainian forces are still conducting clearing operations around the city, neutralizing remaining pockets of resistance and consolidating full control over Pokrovsk. Supply lines are back in operation, and the front has stabilized, with the clear advantage on Ukraine's side. This battle sums up what the war has become: a clash between an army trapped in the past and another that has learned how to fight in the future. Pokrovsk showed that numerical superiority no longer guarantees victory, and that Russia, even with all its resources, faces an enemy that knows how to turn every weakness into opportunity. The impossible happened, and it was Ukraine that made it real. Pokrovsk showed what happens when strategy faces brute force and wins. But what comes next is even more revealing. The losses are so great that the very math of war no longer adds up for Moscow. Men, tanks, resources, everything is running out. Click the card and see the numbers that prove it. Russia's war is already lost.